Thank you very much, David, for a fascinating talk, much as I expected. Who would like to start off the responses?
I'd want to ask a question. Yesterday, we heard, is this working? About the numbers of Jews who are half Jews and part Jews and so on, and the accelerating phenomenon. And today we were hearing about the levels of acceptance of Jews and so on in America. And I find myself wondering, at some point there may already be, if you know, a huge number of Americans who are not Jewish, but they have Jews in their families, and the question of how Judaism Judaizes American culture, as you were talking about, I wonder how important that demographic factor is or might become.
Well, I am, thank God, not a demographer, so it's hard for me to actually, I mean, it would be very interesting to have statistics on this. Do we have any statistics on, I mean, you know, we've got actually statistics, unfortunately, from Nazi Germany. We know how many Mischlinge of the first degree and the second degree there were, and we have some sense of the scope of this issue there. But I'm not sure if we know in America, but your sort of intuition about this is undoubtedly right, that there must be a good many, and probably a demographer could tell you the extent of it. Now, whether this influences directly what Americans think about Jews, because they have, you know, a Jew in their family, you know, I really don't know. I suspect that this is not a major factor. It's probably a complementary factor. It adds to the acceptance of Jews. But I think that it's rather the confluence of a couple of things that I mentioned in my talk. First of all, the decline in anti-Semitism after World War II, which was probably largely a result of I think we can't underestimate the mobilization of this country to fight fascism and the fact that everything fascism stood for, which was, of course, in the case of Nazi Germany, primarily anti-Semitism, that this really created a kind of a reaction, as well as the fact that Jews served in the military, and all these factors played a role in the decline of anti-Semitism after World War II. And the fact that there was that the civil rights issue, the issue of African Americans became the central issue, that the Jews actually benefited from this, because this was the thing people were interested in talking about and arguing about, and Jews became kind of uninteresting. Jews, you know, that combined with, in the 1970s, the rise of the sort of this new evangelicalism, which has this curiously positive attitude towards Jews and Israel. Now, so I'm not sure how much this issue, you know, some people who have Jews in their family, and that would be really interesting to study. I mean, we have these sort of famous cases like Madeleine Albright, who, you know, there's suddenly somebody outs them. You know, some journalist decides to out them, and this becomes less and less interesting, because the more this happens, the more we assume, well, it's probably the case for a lot of people that Wesley Clark has a Jewish father. I sense it's already less interesting than the Madeleine Albright case. I noticed, by the way, that Howard Dean ran an ad for Rosh Hashanah. I can't remember if it was in the foreword. It was in the foreword. It was this fantastic ad. It said, Dr. Howard Dean, M.D., or Governor Howard Dean, M.D., and now I can't remember his wife's name.
Steinberg.
Right, I don't remember.
Steinberg.
Yeah, something Steinberg, Dean, M.D., want to wish you a Shana Tova. So, you know, he's able to, you know, hit 2 home runs with that, you know. He's married to a Jew, and they're both doctors. So, you know, I suspect that as time goes on, this will come to be a more
obvious and accepted thing, and therefore probably of less general interest, but possibly of more general influence in terms of the way people think about Jews.
On that note, can I just interject a personal example? My older daughter is married to a man from a very devout Catholic family. They actually prayed over the question of whether they should accept this marriage or how they should accept this marriage. They have now become so entwined in the Jewish life of my daughter's own family that they went to our first grandson's bar mitzvah and sat through 3 hours in a conservative synagogue without a whimper. They send us Hanukkah cards and Passover cards. And, you know, I think this is a perfect example of what you're talking about. Who else would like to? Do you have a mic? Yeah.
David, I wonder if you could maybe make some differentiations between kinds of multiculturalism. My sense is the way the word is used today in contemporary America is to refer to an appreciation and tolerance of, if you will, different ways of doing the same thing, or even different ways of doing different things, without any hierarchy of cultures. That is, in theory, it means simply a willingness to tolerate and a kind of cultural relativism, but perhaps in a very good way. But the kind of, what you were referring to as multiculturalism, or describing multicultural societies earlier, I think those societies were very different. They had very strict hierarchies. I rather doubt that there were that there was any kind of ideology of multiculturalism at any point, even if the fact that there were. I mean, the Tsarist Empire was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multinational empire, but it was a highly intolerant society. And I wonder if you could comment on that. And also, it seems that the problem is even more complicated because until relatively recently, the last century or century and a half, maybe 2 centuries, most individuals did not have multiple identities, multi-layered identities in the way that we do now. That is, that in the way that most American Jews would define themselves as both Americans and as Jews. But as Yehuda reminded us several times yesterday, that is a relatively rare phenomenon in the history of the Jewish people. That the vast majority of European Jews, before the Enlightenment and even after the Enlightenment, in the case of Eastern Europe, a Polish Jew defined himself as a Jew. He was seen as a Jew, unless he belonged to that tiny, tiny elite of highly assimilated Poles of the Mosaic persuasion. And they were the only people that took themselves seriously, that is to say, Poles didn't. So I'm a little concerned about your use of multiculturalism and the way you've been using it. Now, maybe you didn't intend to blur the distinctions.
Well, I think that actually the more we learn about the Greco-Roman world, the more we're struck by its tolerance. That is, the only thing that will get you in trouble in the Roman Empire is revolt. That would get you in trouble if you declare your independence, if you refuse to pay, tribute to the Caesar. That would get you in trouble. I mean, so there was a political hierarchy, but there wasn't really. I mean, it's true that there are, there is a kind of ancient anti-Semitism that begins to emerge in the Greco-Roman world, but in terms of the sort of political structure of that world, Jews are remarkably tolerated, but not only Jews. That is, most peoples who are considered to have venerable traditions, old traditions, were tolerated. The Jews were already allowed under the when Alexander and his successors ruled the Near East, the Jews are allowed to live according to the laws of their ancestors. And this is well accepted. I mean, polytheism is generally remarkably tolerant religion, or it's not really exactly even a religion. But now, you're right. I mean, this question of the nature of identity, You know, people are working on this in terms of the Greco-Roman world, and I think that, you know, we're learning that there probably were, as there always are, multiple identities. That is, people belong first to a family, to a community, to a guild in terms of their particular occupation. The Jews of this world belonged to particular communities, which often differed quite dramatically from Jewish communities elsewhere. And so they had, although they had an identity as Jews, they also had an identity as Jews of a particular locale.
But that would be true
Now,
of Jews at all times.
Of course it's true of Jews of all times. And that, by the way, is an important fact that we tend to ignore, that Jewish identity itself is not monolithic, but frequently has different layers or different, you know, we assume that a wealthy Balabait in Poland has the same identity, you know, as a poor Jew, and then they don't exactly. Nevertheless, and this is why I did make it clear that I was trying to draw some distinctions, I do think that the nature of the ability to choose one's identity, to create these hybrid identities, or even, I mean, there's such a thing as hybrid identity, but actually multiple identities is something more radical. That is that you hold to two different identities at once, and you may hold them as equally important, Jewish and American, for example. There is something new here. I completely agree with that, and I don't want to be mistaken for saying that the Greco-Roman world is identical to our own. Obviously, it's not. Issues of you know, political freedom and so on, individualism, make this a very different world, and therefore make identity very different.
I think the key is the polytheistic nature.
Yes.
Polytheistic societies are really good for the Jews, i.e.
Yeah.
India and the Greco-Roman world. And it's precisely the monotheistic and crusading nature, there's only one way to salvation of Christianity, that changes that world that you've talked about.
Well, I do want, I mean, I think you're right in general, but I do think there are some very, very big exceptions. I mean, Jews did enjoy, in the early centuries of Islam, a sort of remarkable cultural tolerance.
Yeah.
They entered into that world. Arabic became their language. Much of their culture really is a culture borrowed from the Arabic world. And so it's not only high culture, it also permeates. I mean, the fact that Jews give up speaking Hebrew and they only speak Arabic, not that they spoke Hebrew before, but they probably spoke Greek and Aramaic before, but you know, they take on Arabic, they identify with this culture, and it is a remarkably tolerant culture in many respects. And here I have to disagree with some things that were said before at this conference. It's generally only sectarian movements of Islam that create hostility to the Jews, or pogroms, or attempts at forced conversion.
People are eagerly lining up to get their comments, and I think Lynn Davidman was next, and then I heard from Yehuda Bauer, and Zev again wants to say something, and Derek Pensler, and Yaakov Malkin. So I hope we'll have time for all these important contributions. Lynn?
Everybody.
Ruth?
David, Ruth should be on. Oh, good. David, Ruth's comment about how her Christian Machatenim send her Hanukkah and Passover cards reminds me of how even commercial culture has become a carrier of Jewish life, Jewish identification, Jewish symbolism. And I have a couple of questions related to that. You spoke about filmic representations and how they work culturally in terms of representations of Jews and as carriers of some notions of Jewish identity. And I don't know if you're familiar with, the name of the book eludes me, but Lee Schmidt's book on cards and gifts and their role as carriers of religion. It's a great book. I'll send you the email. Yeah. And so I'm thinking, if Hallmark becomes a carrier of Jewish religious culture, what do you think that tells us?
Sorry, I didn't hear that comment. Did I?
American Greetings is owned by Jews. It's an Orthodox Jewish family.
They're everywhere. They're everywhere.
Barbie and American Greetings.
Well, I mean, I don't think I need to respond to that. I think it's a question that actually says something that is very interesting. Thanks.
Okay, I think we'll come back to you because you had your chance once. Derek?
Okay, well, I have, thanks for a wonderful talk. I have two questions, one modern, one ancient, like your talk. Regarding the first part, I agree with your analysis about this ethnicization of North American culture, which I saw even to the extent of the ethnicization of WASP culture this summer while on holiday at Cape Breton Island in the north of Nova Scotia, where a kind of post-vernacular museum piece Celtic culture has been created, not unlike a kind of post-vernacular Yiddish culture. But I'm wondering about limits to this ethnicization of American culture, particularly regarding Arabs and Muslims. That is, how far can it go? And regarding antiquity, I was wondering if you're familiar with this very provocative book by Seth Schwartz, yes. The Origins of, I forget now, Roman Imperialism. It has some long jury title, but the argument is very simple. He's basically saying that Christianity creates Judaism. Right. You've got this, everything you're saying, this kind of intermarriage and syncretistic practices, and the Jews are doing all kinds of things all over the place. And Christianity is what really solidifies Judaism. Today we're living, you're talking about certain parallels in terms of intermarriage and openness, and yet again, in his scenario, it took this kind of new hegemonic opposing force to make Jews Jewish and then keep Jews Jewish. And I'm wondering if there's any parallels that can be drawn.
Okay, those are really good questions. I mean, I think that the question about whether there are limits to this in terms of Arabs, Muslims. I guess there are about 5 or 6 million Muslims in the United States. Isn't that about right? 6 million. So roughly same number as Jews. And clearly the present, since 9/11, this is very. I mean, they're in a difficult position in this culture. But I think that ultimately, because I don't believe this is endless war. There will come a point where it will, one way or the other, I assume, calm down. The forces in America are so powerful. These integrated forces are so powerful that I would venture to prophesy, dangerous thing to do, that within a generation or so, the same kind of things are going to be happening to Arabs and Muslims. Now, this may be unduly optimistic, and maybe what we're going through now is going to be a much longer conflict. But America has succeeded in. It seems to me that still the primary problem of America is African Americans. That with regard to every other immigrant group, ultimately they do get integrated. African Americans, that's a completely different story. The legacy of slavery is so deep in this country. It's so profound. Its impact on our cities is still so profound, even a century and a half after the Civil War, that this is the real issue for America. And immigrants, I think, are integrated. Oh, wait a minute. I didn't address Derek's second question. Yeah, I know Seth Schwartz's argument. I think it's overstated. But I am persuaded, indeed, that the development, Christianity is originally not one thing. There are many different churches. There are many different, both Jewish and Gentile churches in the first, second, third centuries. And then the process of creating orthodoxy creates, in its turn, heresy. Heresy is a product of orthodoxy. And it turns out we now know that rabbinic Judaism does not sort of spring, fully from the head of Zeus with the destruction of the temple, a mixed metaphor. And it evolves. It takes a long time. A lot of the texts that we assume, even though they're attributed to, say, a 2nd century rabbi, may not have been written until the 5th century. So this process is a long process, and we know now that a lot of it does evolve in a polemic between Christians and Jews. A lot of fundamental concepts, like the idea of Mount Sinai, 613 commandments, actually probably comes from polemics between Jews and Christians in Caesarea. in the late 3rd century. So, yes, Christianity does produce Judaism, but in a more complicated way than just saying it's, because the empire becomes Christian. There's a lot of inner polemic and dialogue between Jews and Christians. And of course, there are forces that are there anyway. It's not simply the case that Christianity produces Judaism.
I think Yehuda was next.
I have basically two questions. One is when you talk about the impact of Jews in Judaism on American culture and American social and political life, do you make a differentiation between the impact of individuals who don't claim to represent any Jewish community or collectivity? I mean, Albright is of course, the extreme example, but you could take any number of other people, I don't know, Stanley Berger or, I don't know, David Sheffer or whoever, and see that as an influence as compared to institutional impact of Jews. That's one point. The other point is it struck me that you may perhaps I misunderstood. There seems to be a kind of a contradiction between the tolerant attitude, in the real sense of the term tolerant. In other words, they tolerated the Jews in Alexandria prior to the pogrom. And the pogrom. I mean, if this was such a tolerant society, then how do we explain this outbreak? And when you draw the analogies, and you're obviously right in saying that analogies don't necessarily work always, but if there is an analogy, where exactly is the analogy there? And perhaps a third comment, the early Islam came into existence in part in opposition to Jewish tribes in the Arabian Peninsula. I mean, the first battles were, in part at least, against a very considerable Jewish influence in the Arabian Peninsula, which was annihilated, except for the area of the Yemen. And does that have an effect on later developments, especially, I agree with the sort of implication of what Todd was saying, that monotheistic belief systems are basically intolerant, and whether that had any influence.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I try to be pretty careful in my remarks to be looking actually at Jewish collective influence, not individual. I think what you say about certain Jewish individuals, Kissinger, Albright, and so on, this is not what I meant by Jewish influence in terms of American politics. I was talking really more about how Jewish institutions, for example, the Holocaust Museum, what it represents, the fact that Jews do have enormous influence in terms of policy towards Israel. There's no doubt about it. And these are organized Jewish kind of collective efforts. And the issue of individuals is a different question. And of course, there were in Imperial Germany, Bismarck's banker, Garrison Bleichroeder was, he had a lot of influence, but that doesn't mean that the Jews had real power in Imperial Germany by any means. So I focused really more on collectivity. With regard to Alexandria, I mean, I indicated the ancient world had anti-Semitism. There were tensions between Jews and non-Jews. The city of Alexandria was not simply an Irenic place. There were social and economic conflicts, and these did break out into a pogrom against the Jews. One of the problems with the so-called lachrymose theory of Jewish history is that we focus on every pogrom and we forget that between, one conflict and the next, sometimes very long periods go by in which the Jews are doing actually quite well. So I don't want to portray the ancient world as being, completely tolerant of Jews and without conflict. By no means. just as it's true in the modern world. We don't exist here without any conflicts, without tensions, anti-Semitism. So I would not, I don't think that undermines the point, the general point. Now, early Islam, yes, of course it's true that there were Jewish tribes that opposed Muhammad, though I would refer you here, again, at the risk of promoting product out on the table there, my book, Cultures of the Jews. And Reuven Firestone has a fascinating chapter on Jewish culture in the Arabian Peninsula, where he shows something that is, I think, not generally known. Everybody knows about those Jewish tribes that were wiped out, but it turns out there were other Jewish tribes. The whole notion of Jewish identity in the Arabian Peninsula was very complicated. There was a lot of moving back and forth. In early Islam, there were Jews who converted to Islam, including prominent Jews or people who became prominent in the Muslim world. In order to account for the fact that Jews enjoy, within a few centuries of the Muslim conquests, a kind of golden age, and I use that term advisedly. I mean, we historians cringe at the word golden age because it tends to sort of paper over real problems and issues. But nevertheless, the fact that the Jews become so integrated culturally into the Arab world within a fairly short time suggests that whatever those conflicts were in the Arabian Peninsula originally, they don't get transported elsewhere. You don't have the same kind of, genocidal attack upon the Jews that seems to be what happened, at least with regard to those tribes. So I think the story is more complicated. There's a tendency, I think, we have today because of the conflict with the Arab world, between Jews and the Arab world, to project backwards and say, well, it was always bad, they always hated us, and we focus on those particular lines in the Quran, which are quite despicable. But the story is much more complicated, and we don't quite understand Jewish history in its full complexity if we ignore the other side.
Thank you. Yaakov?
First, I want to make a comment. I think that David showed us a perfect model, an example of how you can outline a course in Jewish pluralism and Jewish pluralistic culture in a counter-chronological way. And I think that this beginning with Seinfeld and finishing with Biale Peor is a brilliant idea, and I really recommend it to all teachers. As for the contents, I think that the most important point, and maybe the word multiculturalism is not always precise enough. Pluralism may be better. But the most important thing that you showed in your outline is the changing nature of nationality. Jewish nationality changed and is changing. And it's very important to understand that Jewish nationality is not always based, and many times was not based at all, on Jewish religion, like it is today. And therefore the relationship between Jews and non-Jews in intermarriage and even outside of intermarriage is sometimes completely foreign to the problem of religion. It's a problem of culture. And what you showed is that in all these periods, even in periods in the biblical period, when Jewish nationality or identity, national identity, was not identical with Jewish religion, because most Jews, as you said, from Biale Peor on, were worshippers of other gods, not of the Israeli God, and still they were a Jewish nation, the Israelites. So that the nationality changes, the nature of nationality changes. In a recent book of a very close friend of mine, Professor Irad Malkin, called Who is a Greek? He's trying to show how the notion of nation is actually imagined sometimes, but always actual, because our imagination is a very important part of the creation of our identity. And therefore, I think it is very important, especially for us, to underline the change of the nature of nationality, and that our nationality is not based at all on religion, like in so many other periods in our history, and that the relationship between our culture and the cultures of the countries and the nations that we live in enriched both. Because saying that that Christianity defined Judaism is a misnomer, because the question is, what is Christianity? Was in the 2nd or the 3rd century the people who were called by the rabbis minim, meaning heretics, were they really non-Jews? They were Jews who were in the Hasidic sect of the rabbi from Nazareth. But this does not mean that this argument between them defined Judaism. After all, the Second Temple already had a Prushim, already had the basis of rabbinical Judaism. Therefore, I think that it's important for us to realize that nationality in our age is based on our culture. That when we view the history of the Jewish nation from the point of view of the present, we'll find out that in all periods it was based on a national culture in which religion played various roles, but the main role was the interrelationship between our culture and other cultures.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Those are really wonderful contributions here. I want to focus on one thing you said, and that is the way in which the definition of the nation is in fact constructed or invented in different periods and in different ways. There's no question that the Jews are defined as a nation in the late 19th century by particularly thinkers in Eastern Europe who are doing it against the Jewish religion and in an anti-religious way, and the nation is defined, and of course Zionism really comes out of this movement to invent the Jewish nation, because the reality of Eastern Europe and the so-called Pale of Settlement was a Jewish nation. They were the majority in most of the small towns, and there was a sense of being in a Jewish nation that had no power. Now, it's often said, well, you know, if the Jews invented the idea of a nation, then they don't have any right to have their own state because it's a completely invented, imaginary idea. But every nation did this in the 19th century. The Germans invented their nation. They didn't exist as a political nation. They invented it. The French invented a nation out of how many? 360 different kinds of cheese. And I mean, there's a great book by my former teacher, Eugen Weber, Peasants and the Frenchmen. They had to create a French nation. So this process of imagining the nation, of constructing the nation, is an act of inventing a tradition that then leads to the nation. This is something that all modern nationalisms do. And we are still in that process. It's not as if it was invented by, you know, people like Herzl and Haddam and so on, and Dubnov, and that's it. I mean, we are in that process. This very discussion here is part of this process of continuing to invent, reinvent, reconstruct the Jewish nation. And the fact that in antiquity what counted for a Jewish nation was something very different from today shouldn't scare us off. We don't have to necessarily show a direct line of continuity from the ancient period.
I think we have time for Bethany Horowitz, and Sherwin, you wanted to say something too?
The thing I'm thinking about is early on, at some point in your talk, David, which I loved, and I do fear very much the social scientist out of, it's like a different language you're speaking in some ways, although certainly the cultural aspects of it, of how America and Jews are interrelating, is very related to some of the things that I think we've been thinking about across the disciplines. But I'm a little confused about the terms we're talking about now. And it may be a levels of analysis problem. I'm sort of thinking, at one point in your talk, you were talking about what it felt, or maybe it was in the comments, what it felt like to have these multiple identities coexisting. I'm thinking about an individual. So then I'm thinking, let's say the Jew in the Pale of Settlement. Did that person, what do we really know about their identity as a Jew, as a whatever? How many multiple layers were they? how did they mix up and experience them? And I'm thinking what it feels like to be a Jew today. Or like I was thinking about, I was an undergraduate at Harvard, and I went to my 25th reunion about a year ago and did something there that I would never have imagined doing as an undergraduate 25 years ago, which was I made sure the Harvard reunion had a Shabbat dinner as part of the reunion package. And when I proposed this to the committee, they were very receptive, except for one person who thought the Jews were getting too much, that it shouldn't have been possible, that everybody else who was not Jewish chimed in by email saying, no, it's absolutely no problem, of course that should be possible. So the context, it made me think about context, because my desire to have a Shabbat dinner remained constant in some way across those 25 years, and it was still Harvard. But the acceptability of that, the multicultural ideology, which I think was Todd's point, was more prominent, and it had emerged at that point. And I'm still thinking about it as, an individual experiencing that. And then you're ratcheting the whole thing up to this kind of cultural, national, collective, religion, all these bigger things that sort of also get negotiated. And nobody has mentioned the word tradition, where we sort of also negotiate that. We experience it as received, but we reinvent it. So I'm mishmashing a bunch of things, and I'm trying to sort that out, and I want your help.
Well, I'd like to help you, Bethany, but you're going to have to help yourself. No. Well, let me just say one thing about all of that, because, you really opened up, obviously, a lot of big issues. We speak about identity, and then we assume that people in earlier ages also thought about identity. Well, no, identity is a modern word, and it's produced in part anyway by multiculturalism and this question of the politics of identity. So it's very hard to pick up a source from the 19th century or from the 12th century and find people talking about identity. They don't talk about it. It's not, it does become an issue, maybe not necessarily with that word, when Jews are allowed into European society and they have to begin to negotiate their identities or reconstruct them, and they do so often by creating, for example, a German Jewish identity. We know that the German Jews, even those who were very acculturated into Germany, created their own subculture. They socialized with other Jews. Their rituals, including having a Christmas tree, were done in a particularly Jewish way. So they begin to deal with the question of identity. But it is very hard as historians to look to the past and ask a modern question and expect that the sources are there to answer it. Sometimes we have to be kind of creative in pulling that out of the sources, but of course there is the danger that we're imposing on an earlier age issues that are peculiarly our own issues. So that's why the question of identity, multiple identities, say in the Greco-Roman world, it's pretty hard to figure out exactly. You read Philo and, what is his identity exactly? It's kind of hard to... Now, of course, his nephew, Tiberius Alexander, was a general in the Roman army that destroyed Jerusalem. Now, he must have had some wild identity, that guy. It's hard to know. It's hard to get at these questions. And so we are kind of groping a little bit in the dark here.
This word multiculturalism is used so much that I think there's often a confusion. One kind of multiculturalism is there are very strong, distinct groups, and they connect with each other and they borrow from each other, but the core of each group preserves its integrity. The other kind of multiculturalism is what I see in America. One of the things, of course, that Bethany and Lynn both pointed out was that in America, it isn't the group that's so strong, it's the individual. And the individual making all kinds of choices. And in fact, what we have is a smorgasbord. So I do French food on Monday, Italian food on Tuesday. I do Chinese food on Wednesday, and then I do Japanese food on Thursday, and then I just pick. And then not only that, I was at this Unitarian Seder, and I just loved it. I think I'll invite my friends over, and we'll have a little Seder over at the house, and all of a sudden, I mean, it's California for sure. But it's also Michigan. So what you don't have are hardcore communities. You have all these floating individuals. You have all these floating individuals, and each of them and cultures are like smorgasbords. And I like that, and I like that, and I like that, and I like that. So what you don't have are group packages that have little additions to them. What you have are individual packages that just keep picking from this smorgasbord of culture, and that more likely is the model of what is happening in North America than the earlier one.
Well, if I could just maybe defend my native state here. We tend to get a bad rap. I mean, we did just recently have this weird election, but we're frankly not that weird. I would want to maybe take some issue with what you just said, Sherwin. I think that, I know people, for example, who are Jewish Buddhists. And they're really not engaged in a smorgasbord activity. They have found a particular set of traditions which they've combined with Judaism, and although there are variations, obviously, between people, there is a, it's not as if people really hold to all that many identities. I mean, there's only so many hours in the day. And so, what I find is people who actually are trying to construct for themselves a kind of coherent, consistent identity, which may be made up of certain pieces, it may be syncretistic, but that syncretism is actually a lot less individual than we think. These are packages that are out there, that are presented, that one can identify with or reject, and I don't think there is quite as much of this individual creativity going on as you might think. There are obviously all kinds of new phenomena. There are new religious phenomena. America's famous for creating new religions. We're the only country that keeps creating new religions. Look at Mormonism, the fastest growing religion in the world. We created it in this country. I mean, that's what we do. But once these things get created, then people tend to either accept or reject them rather than putting them together in an individual syncretistic package. And so that's what I see happening much more than the raw individualism.
I think we have to.
I know we're running over, and poor Zev is dying to ask one more question. Do we have time?
One quick question?
Yeah.
It will be quick. It goes back to your rabbi and your religion, Seinfeld. Yeah. And the topic of this seminar, love and so forth. In the Larry David show, Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. I don't get HBO, but go ahead.
There's an episode in which a couple is the Jewish guy is about to convert and be baptized. And Larry David bursts in on this conversion and stops it unwittingly. And then the two sides of the family, the Jewish side and the Christian side, who are there for the baptism and I guess the wedding afterward, get into a terrible fight about how much they hate each other, which is something I'd never seen before in American popular culture at all. And I just wanted to ask before, what your take on the issue of Jews actually going ahead and converting out in the name of, love, if that's acceptable in the Jewish world, or if it makes, how you see that.
Well, I know that. Now I'm going to, Zev, you'd like me to speak for the Jews? Is that what you like? I think the interesting question there is actually statistical. How many people really are converting out? Most intermarriages, people don't convert one way or the other, or is a technical term mixed marriage in that case? But I can't remember. But conversion is no longer. It's not the entry ticket to society that it was, say, in 19th century Germany. And so, conversion. My guess is that there's probably more conversion into Judaism when people get married than conversion out. And isn't that borne by the statistics? And so, there is a sense in which Jews, a lot of Jews seem to feel that it's a really pretty important thing when they get married for their partner to convert. Not all Jews, but some minority, substantial minority of intermarriages occur when the non-Jewish partner converts in. which, by the way, has, what I understand, has an interesting byproduct later on. I mean, we usually think of these converts as, you know, they're more Jewish than their Jewish partner, but frequently when the kids are born, they begin to regret having abandoned things, you know, that were so important to them in their own childhood. And so I think even the question of conversion becomes extremely complicated, and it's never just a one-time thing. It keeps getting renegotiated.
We are running out of time, or have run out of time, but I just must say that, David, you have not disappointed my initial curiosity, and I think the tremendous breadth of topics that have been covered here in the last hour and a half is a tribute to the eclectic comprehensiveness of David's scholarly knowledge.